What Ibrahim Traoré reveals about sovereignty, legitimacy, and power in fragile states. Africa, unrestricted. When authority stops working. In parts of the Sahel, the modern African state did not collapse suddenly. It thinned. Authority remained on paper, but its ability to protect territory, enforce decisions, or justify itself to the population weakened year by year. Elections occurred, ministries functioned, international partnerships continued, yet insecurity expanded and trust receded. This is Africa unrestricted. Burkina Faso entered this phase gradually, and then all at once. Armed groups controlled large areas of the country. Rural populations lived under constant threat. The military suffered losses without visible improvement in outcomes. Political leadership changed, but the structure beneath it did not. What failed first was not democracy or development. It was authority. And when authority fails long enough, something else moves in to fill the vacuum. The system that lost credibility. To understand the crisis in Burkina Faso, we must first look at the deeper history of the Sahel. For 1,000 years, great empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai organized life and trade across this vast belt. Caravans moved salt, gold, and knowledge, connecting cities like Timbuktu and Gao, where scholars, jurists, and merchants thrived. Authority was a blend of piety, contract, and custom. European expansion redrew the map, creating French West Africa. New borders, taxes, and cash crops replaced ancient roots and traditions. Independence arrived around 1960 with flags and hope, but the new states inherited wide frontiers, thin revenues, and volatile climates. The devastating droughts of the 1970s and 80s uprooted families and strained governments to their limits. More recently, the collapse of Libya in 2011 pushed weapons and fighters south, fusing local grievances with militant projects. Foreign military partnerships, including France's Operation Barkhane, multiplied, yet violence continued to spread. This is the context in which Ibrahim Traoré appeared on the national stage. Before him, Burkina Faso had already experienced repeated shocks. A popular uprising in 2014 ended a long presidency. A failed coup followed. Civilian governments struggled to regain control of security. For many citizens, the state began to feel distant, procedural, and ineffective. Elections changed faces, but not outcomes. External support arrived, but did not reverse the security trajectory. As attacks persisted, people judged their leaders not by promises, but by protection. The gap between formal legitimacy and the lived reality of insecurity widened into a chasm. Sovereignty became an argument, not just a law. In this environment, credibility mattered more than process. When protection falters, legitimacy thins. The question people quietly asked was not who had the legal mandate, but who could actually act to restore order and provide security. Power without permission. Rather than retell the empire story, here is the hinge. Centuries of Sahel exchange created an expectation that authority keeps roads, markets, and journeys safe. In Burkina Faso, that expectation thinned into daily insecurity. This section bridges past to present, how protection became the test of rule. Caravans once linked towns, jurists, and scholars. The lesson that endured was simple. Authority must safeguard movement. When roads and villages felt exposed, legitimacy drifted toward whoever could act decisively, even outside formal procedure. European cartography left wide borders and lean administrations. Independence brought flags and pride, but also institutions stretched across vast terrain. Add climates that swing from drought to flood and budgets that rarely match the map, and vulnerability compounds. The point here is not chronology, but inheritance. Systems built for extraction struggled at protection. By the late 20th century, the state's core promise, secure space for work, trade, and school, was uneven. That structural fragility set the stage for crisis politics later. After 2011, the southward spill of weapons and fighters collided with local grievances. The effect for citizens was practical, not abstract. Routes closed, services stalled, and fear spread. People recalibrated how they judged leaders, from slogans to tangible security. This is the hinge to Burkina Faso's turn. Urgency began to outrun procedure. The audience started asking a narrower question: who can restore safe movement and daily function, preparing the ground for a break with business as usual? Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in late 2022 through a military coup that itself followed an earlier coup only months before. This rapid sequence matters. It signals not ambition alone, but a profound institutional breakdown. When coups stack, they indicate that no authority is fully stabilized, creating a vacuum. His rise was not framed primarily as ideology, it was framed as necessity. He presented himself as someone acting under immense pressure to restore security, not an opportunist seeking office through patience. That framing resonated powerfully because the system, plagued by years of instability and violence, had already trained people to expect urgency rather than deliberation. This is a dangerous but revealing moment in state evolution. It shows a society pushed to its limits, where the social contract has been renegotiated under duress. When survival becomes the dominant public concern, the formal rules of permission become secondary to the tangible results of performance. Reframing sovereignty. Once in power, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rhetoric and actions focused heavily on a single, powerful idea: sovereignty. But this wasn't the abstract, legalistic sovereignty debated in international forums. For Traoré and his supporters, it meant something far more tangible: absolute control over Burkina Faso's decisions, its strategic partners, and its national narrative. This was a direct response to a deep-seated feeling that the nation's destiny was being written by others. The first and most symbolic move was to sever the long-standing military ties with France. Cooperation was systematically reduced, then terminated completely, ending an era of post-colonial dependency. In its place, new alliances were actively explored, most notably with Russia, but also with neighboring military governments in Mali and Niger, creating a new axis of solidarity in the Sahel. Regional postures that had been fixed for decades began to shift, creating ripples across West Africa and beyond. This pivot was not entirely unprecedented. African leaders have challenged external influence since independence. What made Traoré's approach distinct was the clarity and force of its framing. He presented external dependence not as a technical choice or a pragmatic partnership, but as a fundamental structural vulnerability, a continuation of colonial-era dynamics that kept the nation weak. The message was simple enough to travel quickly through social media and public rallies, and serious enough to command the world's attention. In this context, sovereignty functioned as a powerful legitimacy substitute. In a political landscape where the traditional marker of legitimacy, a democratic election, was absent, this new ideological legitimacy, rooted in national pride and anti-imperialist sentiment, stepped in to fill the void. It offered a compelling justification for military rule, arguing that true democracy is impossible without true sovereignty first. This is not a phenomenon unique to Burkina Faso. It is a recurring pattern seen across fragile states, where the failure of the existing system to provide security and prosperity creates an opening for a new, more radical vision of the nation. Mobilizing without institutions. Traoré leaned heavily on popular mobilization. Public speeches, symbolic gestures, and appeals to national pride became tools for consolidating support. This mattered because institutions were weak. Mobilization filled the gap. However, mobilization is not governance. It creates energy, not capacity. It rallies support, but it does not automatically build supply chains, reform militaries, or stabilize economies. The risk here is structural. When authority relies on momentum rather than institutions, it must keep moving. Pauses look like failure. Compromise looks like retreat. Over time, the system becomes brittle, where power tightens. As Traoré consolidated control, the state narrowed political space. Media restrictions increased. Opposition voices weakened. This is not unusual in post-coup environments, but it introduces a familiar tension. Centralization can improve coordination in the short term. It can also remove feedback. When feedback disappears, errors compound silently until they surface violently. The challenge is not whether power should be centralized temporarily. The challenge is whether that centralization can transition into durable institutions before legitimacy decays again. What holds and what strains? What holds in this case is clarity. Traoré articulated a clear diagnosis of dependency and loss of control that many citizens already felt. He aligned rhetoric with visible actions. That alignment restored a sense of agency, at least symbolically. What strains his capacity? Sovereignty rhetoric raises expectations that only institutions can meet. Security gains must be sustained. Economies must function under pressure. Alliances must deliver results, not just alternatives. History is not kind to systems that rely too long on urgency alone. What his story teaches us. His story teaches us that sovereignty is not an emotion. It is an administrative and institutional condition. When states cannot protect their territory or justify their decisions, alternative forms of legitimacy emerge, often abruptly. What can be learned is that clarity matters. Populations respond to leaders who name structural failures plainly and act in visible ways. Ambiguity erodes trust faster than ideology ever could. What should not be repeated is the belief that mobilization can substitute for institutions indefinitely. Power acquired through crisis must eventually be normalized into systems, or it recreates the very instability it claimed to resolve. Africa's challenge is not choosing between authority and legitimacy. It is building states where authority earns legitimacy continuously, not episodically.